For generations, migrants from China attempted to hide themselves away, to make themselves small, to wrap their lived reality in silence. It's the storyline of many a diasporic storyteller attempting to narrate the stories of those who never spoke, who died without evoking their own histories. Today, then, I want to talk about the dead, but also about the living. When we talk about putting right past injustices or simply having history acknowledge the wrongs done to whole communities now long gone, we are in fact talking about achieving justice for the dead, for those who suffered and who were victims in the past. But in attempting to write a just account of the past, whether recounting personal family stories or attempting to address collective, national, and global wrongs, the weight of the present often seems even heavier than that of the past. But in attempting to write a just account of the past, whether recounting personal family stories or attempting to address collective, national, and global wrongs, the weight of the present often seems even heavier than that of the past. The root cause of most injustices done to Chinese people, people of Chinese origin, in the 20th century are to be found in 19th century imperialism and in particular the Opium Wars. The United Kingdom's aggressive policies in the 19th century represented a shift from a European perspective that saw the Enlightenment's imagined China as a source of wonder and inspiration to one that denigrated and despised what became seen as a decadent and declining civilization. This ideological shift was necessary to justify the military and economic domination that Britain wished to impose, just as it had on the Indian subcontinent and later on in Africa. The other European powers, America and even Japan, would follow suit. That 19th century Western imaginary of the Chinese as the feeble and unequal other permitted numerous mass injustices in the 19th and 20th centuries. For instance, America's 19th century exclusion of Chinese from entry and citizenship of the USA, which continued until the 1940s, and the UK's forced repatriation of thousands of Chinese seamen after World War II. Both were facilitated by sustained xenophobic hate campaigns against an imagined yellow peril. As we know, that imaginary has not gone away and is always there to be exploited by the populist politicians and media. As the COVID-related anti-Asian hatred in the USA and the UK sadly recently demonstrated. In such an atmosphere, the prospects of wrongs done to Chinese people in that diaspora being righted, or even simply addressed, remains remote. Added to such historical obstacles, the current geopolitical configuration and changed perceptions of nation-state China in the Western imaginary renders inaudible voices that seek a reassessment of the West's historic mistreatment of China and Chinese people. Against these odds, can storytellers, playwrights, and poets make a difference in illuminating the woes suffered by those now long dead? One of the greatest storytellers of recent times is Hilary Mantel, who's become well known for her historical novels. Mantel understood the function of history, who uses it, and for what purpose. Nowadays, we often hear the expressions fake news and controlling the narrative, but history itself is a narrative. And I can only agree with Hilary Mantel when she writes, history is what people are trying to hide from you, not what they're trying to show you. You sift for it in the same way you sift through landfill for evidence of what people want to bury. A history, after all, is the, or rather a story of the past, not a mirror held up to the past. In everyday speech, we often confuse history with the past itself. But history is nothing if not multiple stories telling the past, never final, always contingent. Today, I'll talk in part about big histories with a global reach, such as the ongoing histories of colonialism. For instance, both Hong Kong and China as a whole are still in the long shadow of the Opium Wars, and everything that came in its wake still envelops us. But I'll also talk about micro-histories, histories of small communities and families. These histories often fall between the cracks and are never told. And sometimes, as Hilary Mantel suggests, it's what's hidden that is revealed by what is told. And thus it is in the margins, in the abandoned, outlying landfills, that we must sift for what is buried, for therein lies the hidden story. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, first-generation migrant communities who arrived from China hid their stories, their journeys, their traumas from their immediate descendants. Many of those who migrated from mainland China to Hong Kong in the 1950s to the 1970s fall into this category. Many parents did not wish to burden their children with stories of how bad things had been before, how rough getting set up in Hong Kong had been. The children of those newly arriving understandably only looked to the present and, of course, to the future. Their life was Hong Kong now. Several former students I taught in Hong Kong have recently decided to emigrate. They said to me that only when they themselves came to consider leaving Hong Kong did they start thinking about their parents and grandparents who'd left China for Hong Kong. Only then did they start to think about their place in a longer family story of displacement. Often it falls to the third generation to seek out the past of their grandparents, and by then it's often too late. Such was my own experience, an experience that propelled me into a lifelong quest. When my grandfather died, I was only 7 years old, but I'd spent every day of those 7 years by his side. After he died, I had many questions, but no one to answer them. My grandfather's children, my mother, my uncles, had spent their lives trying to assimilate into a hostile white society, and none of them had tried to know more about their father's life or where he'd come from and what motivated him. So my questions drew a blank and went unanswered. So I embarked on a long journey, better to understand that old man who'd made my childhood so exceptional and exciting. But how was I to do that? While national institutions keep records of all kinds, ordinary families do not, and histories get written by those who establish and possess the records. When I was writing my recent book, The Eighth Chinese Merchant and the Disappeared Seaman, the records that were and are available were all made and kept by white British record keepers. I realized early in my attempt to write an academic history of Liverpool Chinatown that it would result in nothing more than a one-sided account. That is why I turned eventually to documentary fiction. It was my attempt to give voice to those who had left no records. In fact, it was my attempt to have the dead speak. Recently, I've written about new writing in the Hong Kong Chinese diaspora, especially in the domain of poetry. Many poems use or deploy nostalgia and memories. However, memories and nostalgia alone, in and of themselves, cannot make history. Nostalgia is a yearning for the past, but it's also a mourning for a present that has been denied and a future that will not happen. And memories do not stack up like chronologically ordered snapshots of the past. Again, according to Hilary Mantel, I quote, "We talk about buried parts of our past and assume the most distant in time are the hardest to reach. But," says Mantel, "I don't think memory is like that. Rather, it's like St. Augustine's spreading limitless room." In talking of memory, we often employ metaphors relating to archaeology or topology, digging deep to find them. But as Mantle explains, echoing St. Augustine, we can imagine memory as spread out on a great plain, a steppe where all the memories are laid side by side at the same depth, like seeds under the soil. In other words, unlike archaeologists, we do not have to dig deep through layers of accumulated time to reach our memories. Our memories of, for some of us, distant childhood and our memories of yesterday coexist side by side. And places we revisit trigger memories, and not in a logical or chronological order. Recently, I was asked to participate in a public discussion organised by the UK's Tate Art Gallery. The discussion focused on exploring Chinese identity and multi-generational experiences in the United Kingdom. The organiser proposed as the prompt a phrase borrowed from the book Scattered Belongings, Cultural Paradoxes of Race, Nation and Gender by Jane Ifekunigwe. The belongings of those dislodged from their original homeland are scattered and untidy. Scatter, as we know, is the literal translation of the ancient Greek verb diasporein, meaning literally to scatter. And it's the Greek word that gives us the modern English word diaspora. Those who left China were scattered across all 5 continents of the globe, and scattered with them were their memories, their languages, and their customs. We can think of memories as belongings scattered around St. Augustine's immense room. But let's put aside the writings of the Christian saint for a Buddhist text. Let us recall the 5 remembrances, or 5 daily reflections, found in the Buddhist discourse, the Upajjhatthana Sutta. I am sure to grow old. There is no way to escape it. I am sure to fall ill. There is no way to escape it. I am sure to die. There is no way to escape it. But it's the last 2 contemplations in particular that seem most relevant to our musing on diaspora. There is no way to escape being separated from everyone I love and everything that is dear to me. And finally, my deeds are my only true belongings. My actions are the ground upon which I stand. These are not contemplations that were composed with the Chinese diaspora in mind. They were reflections on the human condition. To the refugee, to the exile, the migrant, it's a daily reality that they are separated from all they love and hold dear. But it's the last contemplation that perhaps holds the key to transcending a sense of loss evoked in the Buddhist sutta. The condition of separation. Taking to heart the last of the 5 reflections, our true belongings would not be nostalgic memories, but rather our actions constituting the ground upon which we stand. What has guided me personally over the past 40-odd years of academic career is simply this, that in order to act meaningfully, we need first to seek a just reckoning of the past. Hardly anywhere do we enjoy that today, but we need always to strive towards it. Today's world is always a consequence of the past. Climate change, the most pressing issue of our time, is a function of humankind's past actions. Past deeds can now be clearly seen as bad deeds, and yet the descendants of those who committed them, those who continue to benefit from them, do not wish to take responsibility. But if we wish to be good actors, current actions need to be based on recognizing unacknowledged bad actions of the past. Only then can today's deeds constitute a stable ground on which to stand. If we reflect on those living the diasporic condition, we find a landscape that is messy, complicated, fragmented. Fragmentation, and for want of a better word, hybridity, are the legacy of colonialism. As Stuart Hall described it so well when he wrote, "In this post-colonial moment, the sensibilities of colonialism are still potent. We, all of us, are still its inheritors, still living its terrifying aftermath. Students often get confused about the relationship between colonialism and post-colonialism and would like clear chronological definitions. Despite the heralding of the post-colonial moment, we find ourselves both in its continued workings and in its aftermath. Again, Hall puts it succinctly. In the case of the colonial and the post-colonial, what we are dealing with is not two successive regimes, but the simultaneous presence of a regime and its after effects. Colonialism persists despite the cluster of illusory appearances to the contrary. End quote. Let me come to a specific instance of colonial aftermath, the Chinese diaspora of the United Kingdom. Chinatowns and Chinese communities in the UK, in a more general sense, are changing. Indeed, the concentrated arrival of 200,000 new migrants from Hong Kong over the past 3 years has significantly changed the makeup of the so-called Chinese community in the United Kingdom. In fact, what we are seeing is the formation of a Hong Kong Chinese British community with a distinct historical, linguistic, socio-economic background. Where Putonghua-speaking mainland Chinese who'd settled in the UK from the 1990s onwards had inflected the linguistic characteristics of the then existing so-called Chinese community, so that Cantonese had become a minority language, suddenly now the balance has tipped once again, and the Cantonese-ness of a large part of the community has been reaffirmed. However, those who constitute that emerging Hong Kong Chinese community may not themselves yet imagine themselves as such. The celebrated French thinker Etienne Balibar wrote that all communities are imaginary, but only imaginary communities are real. However, in the cultural field, in the field of literary creation, both Hong Kong first-generation migrants and descendants of migrants are now publishing and being noticed. So much so that we now have a vibrant UK network of writers who have a connection with Hong Kong. This in itself is a unique phenomenon that has enriched the UK's writerly community, both in poetry and in fiction writing. Some write exclusively in English, some write in both English and Chinese. When I first became interested in Hong Kong diasporic writing in the UK some 30-odd years ago, the landscape looked very different. I was coming at the subject from two different directions. At the time, I was teaching at the University of Chicago and trying to stretch the boundaries of sinology and Chinese studies, and I had become very interested in Chinese American writing and realized that while almost all major US universities had Chinese American studies programs, Chicago University did not. So I set up a regular workshop in Asian American literary studies and invited writers to Chicago over a period of 3 years. While most of them had been writing since the 1970s, at the time, these writers were just gaining wider recognition, and apart from Maxine Hong Kingston, very few were widely read. Coming to the USA from the UK, naturally my next question was, where was the equivalent literary culture in the United Kingdom? First, there was a question of terminology. Chinese American writers asserted their Americanness, while their ethnicity qualified it. In the 1980s, they'd argued for the dropping of the hyphen in Chinese American. They were not somehow half Chinese, half Americans connected by a hyphen. They were Americans, asserting their Chinese heritage. A proper noun, American, qualified by an adjective, Chinese. In a very real sense, that sets them apart from what we call the Chinese diaspora. The logic of the diaspora is that there is an original center from which people have spread out. China. Many in the UK still refer to themselves as British Chinese and see no problem with that. Others in the entertainment and creative industries now talk of themselves as British East and Southeast Asian, which is meant to include those of Chinese heritage from the Southeast Asian region, including Singapore and Malaysia. Note, however, that the British in British Chinese is still the qualifier, as if it referred simply to a nationality, to a passport identity. My personal preference would be Chinese British. These are issues over time that will doubtless be settled. Let's focus for now on the writing. Diasporic writing can be seen as constituting that landfill that Mantle referred to. In it, we may find elements of what mainstream society and the first generation of migrants themselves wanted to bury. As you now know, the reason I'm here today is that I started my career trying to uncover buried stories of the past, that of the history of the Chinese in the UK, of a Chinatown family. By the time I became an academic, this interest combined for me both personal microhistory and a broader interest in Chinese migrant communities. My grandfather had migrated to the UK in 1911, not from Hong Kong, which was far from being the cosmopolitan hub it is today, but from Guangdong province, from Namhoi. People only started migrating to the UK from Hong Kong in the 1960s. When I started looking, there was little writing emanating from Chinese communities in the 1980s and 1990s. In Britain, apart from Timothy Moe, writers from Hong Kong were few and far between. In Liverpool, Graham Chan, a university librarian, ran a Chinese British literary magazine called Brushstrokes. In London, Jessie Lim and the actor David Yip ran a drama and poetry workshop for the Lambeth Chinese Community Association. They produced a booklet of the work of the burgeoning poets called Exploring Our Chinese Identity. Students who took my course Cultures at the Margins at the University of Hong Kong in the mid-1990s will remember this. Most of the poems were written by second-generation Hong Kongers whose parents had only migrated to the UK in the 1960s and 1970s. The Hong Kong Chinese community was thus relatively new. Before the Second World War, people had migrated directly to the UK from Guangdong. And Chinatown families were, to use that awful expression, mixed race, with a Chinese father and a white, English, or more often Irish mother. There is a special place in the racist imaginary for the half-white offspring. But that particular scourge was spared to the second-generation Hong Kong Chinese of the post-1960s generation. Nevertheless, those second-generation migrants had a double burden. Not only were they a visible Chinese minority, with all the negativity that accompanied that in the 1970s, 80s and 90s, but as the children of migrants working mainly in the catering industry, they were up against class bias as well. And there is no more class-ridden society than Britain. Many of the young writers wrote poems that dealt with problems of belonging, of fitting in, of life lived in the Hong Kong Chinese catering trade, and of course of everyday racism. They are very moving poems, full of raw pain and the echo of quotidian fear. One poem in the collection recounts the terrible story of an 8-year-old girl who just moved house and started a new school. She was violently attacked by another pupil who tried to strangle her. No one helped, not the other pupils, and the teachers intervened belatedly. But there is no comfort for this child, and even her mother blames her, calls her stupid. My fault for being Chinese, my fault for being there, my fault for being strangled. They made me feel outcast, guilty, and I don't understand why. These are passionate and emotive poems used by the writers cathartically to at least share their lonely existence with others like them. 30 years later, Chinese Hong Kong poets in the UK perhaps write more polished, more sophisticated poetry, but express similar sentiments, a similar sense of separation and often of abandonment. These poems are also an attempt to mark moments that constitute a micro-history. These are representations of a lived reality that you won't find in any British history book. The Soviet-era Russian poet Marina Tsvetaeva deployed poetry as a historical and critical discourse, and these small poems, in a similar way, set down wayside milestones in place of a history that ignored them. Nowadays, there is a greater acceptance of the work of Hong Kong Chinese second-generation writers. Recently, Angela Hoy published her memoir, Takeaway, which recounted her childhood upbringing in a Welsh village where her Hong Kong parents ran a takeaway restaurant. They could barely speak English, and it fell to the children to deal with the foreigners. It's not a new story. What is new is that a dominant white liberal readership has now noticed it and given it critical acclaim. At least now there are those who speak out against anti-Asian hatred, those who record it. But what about those who have gone before and who left no written trace? Can their stories be told? Can their stories enter into big history? It's always presumptuous to speak on behalf of the dead. In some ways, it's a selfish act. When we speak in the place of the dead, we are attempting to fill a void, an emptiness, to make up for something unknown in our own history. But is it not right to give voice to those who have now left us? Such is what I decided to do with the story of my own grandfather, my own family, a story filling the space that should be filled by microhistory. It's also the narration of the collision or coincidence of a family story with a larger story that went untold for 50 years and only now is starting to enter into a bigger history. I refer, of course, to the forcible removal, the deportation of Chinese seamen who had settled down in the UK after World War II. There were men who had wives and families and houses in the United Kingdom, and yet they were literally dragged away in the night, put on ships, and returned to an uncertain fate in a China turned upside down by civil war. We know very little about what happened to these men. For 50 years, their wives were too scared to even mention what had happened to their husbands. Their children were left in ignorance. And then when the guardians of the records decided to open them some 20-odd years ago, it was then too late to track down those men. There is a reason why governments put embargoes on official records. It's to protect the agents of government, the actors. In this case, we can call them the bad actors. The story is a sad one and left behind massive, unfillable holes in people's lives and added up to a lack of closure. There's no way that my own personal efforts could make up for that lack of closure. Others too have tried and failed. All I attempt to do in my book, The Eighth Chinese Merchant and the Disappeared Seaman, is to speak for my grandfather, that part of his life that ran parallel to theirs. He knew their story, and he was part of their story. He owned and managed the cafe frequented by the sailors who risked their lives between 1939 and 1945 to keep the UK supplied in food and armaments coming across the Atlantic Ocean. I don't presume to speak for these men, but I do try to put myself in the shoes of my grandfather. When I decided to make my book a dual language book, in both English and written Cantonese, I wanted to get as close to the language as possible, the language that he might have used. The language of the UK Home Office, the police, the immigration officers, the colonial superstructure was English, but that was not the language used by my grandfather in the 50 years he lived in the United Kingdom. This meant an effort. I was helped by collaborators, my former students, who tried to imagine and to reconstruct the language that might have been used by a man who left Canton in 1911 and who died before Hong Kong Cantonese became the new standard. It's far from me to judge whether my collaborators and I succeeded in reconstructing a language that is now changed beyond recognition. But at least a Chinese voice was given to this story of Chinese people, so that they emerged not just as objects and victims, but also as speakers and actors in their own right. I don't know whether the enterprise represented by my book could be described as an act of love. I see it more as an attempt at recognition and empowerment. This territory that is Hong Kong, this region that is the Cantonese-speaking region, has seen so much turmoil, so much emigration over the past 2 centuries that we forget sometimes that its people and its intellectuals contributed so much to the construction of an imaginary of Chineseness. It is a notion of Chineseness that was diverse, and they expressed that Chineseness just like Sun Yat-sen in the Cantonese language. Can we love a language? We can certainly mourn its passing, but then surely we can also strive to keep it alive. It's also a sign of respect for the dead to keep the legacy of language alive. I'm not advocating some form of linguistic particularism. My grandfather spoke at least 4 or 5 Chinese languages in his Chinatown cafe, all of them worthy of respect and recognition. Neither in mainland China nor in Hong Kong can we return to some notion of pure Cantonese as it was spoken a century ago. Languages are social, organic, they evolve, they change, but we can make an effort to respect languages that were once spoken, and we should maintain the possibility of revisiting them. Languages of the past belong not only to the past, they are also a gift from our forebears to us, the descendants. There's so much injustice in the world, so much wrong that has been done. We could spend our days lamenting, regretting, and resenting. But is that the way our forebears would have wished us to live? As academics, we have a responsibility to record, to criticize, to shed light. We can only do that by embracing universal values, not simply the values of the European Enlightenment, but those that all cultures around the globe have bequeathed to us. The great advantage of living in the 21st century is that we can look back not just on a single, narrowly defined culture, history, and philosophy, but on a multiplicity of them. As academics, as members of global society, we shall not only be judged by our words, but also by our actions. My deeds are my only true belongings. My actions are the ground upon which I stand.